A hilltop in southeastern Turkey, a single carved pillar rising from the earth, older than anything we thought possible. It was raised around 9,600 years before the Common Era. That is roughly 11,600 years ago. Stonehenge came later. The pyramids of Egypt came later still. This place predates them both by more than 6,000 years. It was built before pottery, before the wheel, before metal tools, before farming itself. By every model we have for how civilization begins, this site should not exist. And yet there it stands, covered in symbols. Hundreds of them, carved across pillar after pillar with deliberate care. For decades, nobody could read them. Now a string of researchers claim they finally can, and that the message rewrites the human story. So here's the question. What do these carvings actually say? To understand why this hilltop unsettles the experts, you first have to understand who is supposed to be incapable of building it. In the middle of the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began digging into a low mound near the city of Sanliurfa. The local name for the place meant Potbelly Hill. Earlier surveys had passed over it, mistaking the stone tops poking through the soil for an abandoned medieval cemetery. Schmidt looked at the same ground and saw something else entirely. What he pulled from the earth in the years that followed did not fit anywhere in the textbooks. Beneath the slope lay rings of standing stone. Not a single monument, but enclosure after enclosure. Circles of massive pillars arranged with obvious intent. At least 20 of them are now known to lie buried in the hill. The pillars themselves are the kind of thing you have to see to believe. Carved in the shape of a great letter T, the tallest stand around 18 feet high, the heaviest weigh as much as 50 tons, and they are not blank. Their faces are covered in animals, foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, boar, cut into the limestone in deep relief with a precision that has made modern stonemasons uneasy. People who work stone for a living have stood before these carvings and admitted they would struggle to match them today, with metal chisels and power tools the builders never had. Because that is the part that breaks the model. The people who raised these stones had nothing we associate with civilization. They had no pottery, they had no wheel, they had no metal of any kind, only flint and bone and stone. They had not yet learned to farm. They were hunter-gatherers, following herds and gathering wild grain, the very people our histories file under primitive. And yet somehow these supposedly primitive bands quarried 50-ton blocks, shaped them, hauled them, stood them upright in careful circles, and decorated them with a visual language nobody could read. To grasp how strange that is, hold the dates in your mind for a moment. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9,600 years before the Common Era. The first true cities, the first writing, the first kings, all of that lay 6,000 years in the future. The distance between these builders and the pharaohs of Egypt is greater than the distance between the pharaohs and us. By everything we thought we knew, the order was fixed. First farming, then villages, then surplus, specialists, leaders, religion, and only at the very end, monuments like this. Göbekli Tepe runs that order backwards. The temple comes first, and the city never seems to come at all. For a long time, the scholarly world had a single word for a thing that should not be there. They called it an anomaly, a glorious exception, a one-off accident of the record that changed the timeline for one site and nothing more. It was a comfortable label, and it let everyone carry on. But that label was about to face 20 more years of digging, and it did not survive them. For a label like that to hold, the site has to stay alone. An anomaly is only an anomaly as long as there is nothing beside it. The moment a second example appears, the word loses all its power, and that is precisely what began to happen. In the early 1920s, Turkey launched the most ambitious archaeological effort the region had ever seen. They called it the Taz Tepeler Project, the project of the Stone Hills. It was not a single dig. It was a coordinated survey of an entire landscape, drawing hundreds of scientists from dozens of institutions to map not one site, but 12, scattered across roughly 150 kilometers of southeastern Anatolia. They were no longer asking what Gobekli Tepe was. They were asking what it belonged to. The answer came out of the ground, site by site. The most striking of them sits a short distance away, a place called Karahan Tepe, and when the excavators cleared its enclosures, the effect was uncanny. The same T-shaped pillars, the same circular arrangements, the same carved animals in the same deep relief, the same construction methods, repeated stone for stone, and Karahan Tepe was not the only one. Across the whole spread of hills, the same fingerprints kept surfacing. The same everything. Now hold what that actually means. For 30 years, the experts had treated Gobekli Tepe as a solitary puzzle, a single freak of the record, sitting by itself on its hilltop. The Taz Tepeler survey revealed something the comfortable label had hidden completely. Gobekli Tepe was not alone, and it was not even the whole story. It looks instead like the great ceremonial center of something far larger, a connected regional culture that had been lying beneath these hills the entire time. Not one temple, a network. And networks do not build themselves. Sit with the demands of that for a moment. To raise the same kind of monument in the same style, using the same methods at site after site across 150 kilometers of broken mountain country, you need more than a good idea. You need shared knowledge. You need people moving between the sites carrying that knowledge in their heads. You need agreement on how a pillar should be cut, how an enclosure should be laid out, what the carvings should look like, and you need that agreement to hold across communities that may have been days of hard travel apart. This is coordination on a scale we simply did not grant to people of this age. Before a single city existed anywhere on Earth, before farming had fully taken hold, before any of the civilizations we study in school had drawn their first breath, a scattered network of communities was working from what amounts to a shared plan. The anomaly had quietly become a civilization, and a civilization that can hold a single architectural vision across a region for centuries is doing something that goes beyond stone. It is holding a set of ideas in common, a shared way of marking the world. Which brings us to the carvings themselves, because if these communities were speaking to one another across all that distance and all that time, then the symbols they left behind are where that conversation should still be visible. And a handful of researchers believe it is. Start with what is not in dispute. Across all 12 sites, the same small set of symbols keeps appearing. Researchers count roughly 20 core images that show up again and again. The snake, the fox, the scorpion, the vulture, the boar. A handful of abstract shapes, carved in the same way, placed in similar positions, repeated across hundreds of pillars over centuries of building. That much you can see with your own eyes. The argument begins with what it means. To the researchers who have studied the full body of carvings, this is not decoration. It is too consistent to be decoration. Linguists have a word for a system like this, a semasiography. It is not writing as we understand it. There is no alphabet here, no record of spoken words you could sound out, but it is a deliberate system of meaning all the same, a way of carrying ideas and fixed signs that everyone in the network would have understood. And the case for deliberation rests on a single quality above all others: consistency. According to the analysis, the proportions of these symbols vary by less than 6% from one site to the next. Think about what that figure is claiming. Communities that may have spoken different languages, separated by days of difficult travel through the mountains, are said to have carved the same signs to the same proportions for something like 8 centuries. 800 years. That is longer than the entire history of the United States. That kind of agreement, held across that much time and that much distance, does not happen on its own. It does not drift into place. It requires institutions. It requires training. It requires someone checking the work and correcting it, generation after generation, so the signs do not wander. And then the claim goes further still, because the researchers say these symbols do not merely repeat. They follow rules. Look at which images appear beside which, they argue, and patterns emerge that pure artistic whim would never produce. A snake and a particular hooked shape are said to cluster together far more often than chance allows. The scorpion almost never appears without a bird carved somewhere nearby. Snakes are grouped in even numbers, 3s and 6s and 9s, and the odd numbers are simply absent. These are not coincidences, the argument runs. These are rules. Something close to grammar, cut into stone. The enclosures themselves seem to echo that same hidden order. One circle is dominated by snakes, another by foxes, another by boar. As though each community that gathered at the site brought its own emblem, its own animal, its own designated place within a shared symbolic world. This was not a temple where everyone worshipped the same way. It looks more like a structured system in which different groups held different roles and different identities inside something larger than any one of them. That is the claim at its boldest. A grammar without a voice, enforced for centuries by people whose entire purpose was to maintain it. And if the symbols truly obey rules, then somewhere in this network there should be a single carving where those rules combine to say something specific. There is one pillar that the believers point to above all others. They say it records a date. Picture the pillar first, because the pillar is the heart of the argument. Archaeologists call it Pillar 43, though most people know it by another name, the Vulture stone. Its face is crowded with carvings, around 47 distinct figures arranged not at random but in stacked horizontal bands, one above another, like lines of text running down a page. A great vulture sits near the center with its wings spread, and the geometry around it is unnervingly exact. The central figure rests close to the precise midpoint of the whole composition. The bands are aligned to within a couple of millimeters across the width of the stone. Whatever this is, it was not casual. Someone planned the entire arrangement in full before a single chisel touched the surface, and one researcher believes he has worked out what it records. His name is Martin Sweatman, a chemical engineer who fed high-resolution images of the Vulture stone into astronomical software and reached a conclusion that electrified everyone who wanted to believe. The animals, he argued, are not animals at all, they are constellations. The vulture, he says, maps onto the stars we call Sagittarius, the scorpion onto Scorpius. Read the carving as a star chart, and it points to a specific sky, the sky as it appeared roughly 13,000 years ago, during a violent climate upheaval known as the Younger Dryas. By this reading, the stone is a date. A moment in the heavens, locked into limestone by people watching the same sky we do. It is a thrilling idea, and honesty demands that we state plainly why most experts do not accept it. The German Archaeological Institute, the body that has done more work at this site than anyone, published a detailed rebuttal, and its objections are hard to wave away. The first is timing. The radiocarbon dates for this enclosure run more than 1,000 years younger than the sky Sweatman, says the stone records. The carving, in other words, may be far too recent to be remembering that ancient sky at all. The second objection is deeper. Constellations are not real. They are not written into the stars. They are shapes that human cultures invent, and they differ from one people to the next. There is no reason to assume that hunter-gatherers 11,000 years ago grouped the stars the way Greek astronomers would much later, and every reason to think they did not. Read a vulture into Sagittarius, the critics say, and you are seeing your own sky in their stone. Both positions deserve to be weighed. The astronomical reading may simply be wrong. But notice what survives, even if it is. The dating dispute does not touch the geometry. Whatever the figures mean, the precision of the composition is not in question. The midpoint is still the midpoint. The bands are still aligned to the millimeter. Someone built a monument of extraordinary exactness, populated it with symbols that seemed to follow rules, and arranged the whole thing with the care of a person recording something they did not want lost. Whatever they were saying it deliberately. So set the meaning aside for a moment and look instead at how the carving itself changes over time, because that pattern points somewhere stranger than any single date. Here is every civilization we have ever studied, reduced to a single shape. The Egyptians built rougher pyramids first and refined them over centuries until the lines ran true. Greek temples grew more graceful with each generation of builders. Roman engineering reached further and higher decade by decade. The shape is always the same. Skill accumulates, knowledge compounds, ambition climbs. People start clumsy and slowly get better, because that is what learning looks like, and we have never once seen it work any other way. At Göbekli Tepe, it runs backwards. The earliest layers, the deepest and the oldest, hold the largest pillars, the most ambitious enclosures, the deepest and most confident carving found anywhere at the site. The builders were at their best when they began. The layers above them, raised centuries later, tell a story of decline. The pillars get smaller, the relief grows shallower, the compositions get simpler. By the final phase of building, the work is comparatively crude, clumsy imitations of earlier forms made by people who clearly could no longer match what their ancestors had done. The symbols decay along with the stone. According to the analysis of the carvings, the earliest builders followed the pairing rules, the grammar of snake and bird and scorpion around 92% of the time. By the middle period, that obedience slips. By the final phase, it falls close to the level of random chance. Within 800 years, a culture went from maintaining a strict symbolic order to barely remembering the order had ever existed. The way they cut the stone tells the same story. The earliest builders appear to have used a technique of startling sophistication, thermal shock fracturing. They heated the limestone to a high temperature, then struck it with cold water, and the sudden stress split the rock along lines they had chosen in advance. To do that, you have to understand the stone from the inside, how it holds heat, where it will break, exactly when to apply the water. It is knowledge, hard-won and precise. And then it vanishes. Later quarries show only crude pecking with hammerstones, the brute force method of people who no longer knew the elegant one. The thermal technique disappears from the record within a few centuries of its first appearance. Now here's the detail that is hardest to explain away. There are no practice stones anywhere in the quarry fields. No botched first attempts. No learning curve. No slow climb toward competence at the beginning. The skill does not appear tentatively and then improve, the way invention always does. It arrives fully formed, at its absolute peak, executes with extraordinary precision, and then drains slowly away across the generations until it is gone entirely. Sit with that, because it inverts everything. Invention starts poor and gets rich. This starts rich and gets poor. That is not the signature of a people working something out for the first time. It is the signature of a people who were handed something already finished and slowly forgot how it was made, which forces the question the title of this script is built around. If this knowledge was inherited rather than invented, then there is only one thing left to ask. Inherited from whom? Before we reach for anyone, the ground itself offers a quieter answer, and it begins with the strangest thing these people ever did. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, something deliberate happened across the entire network. Every site was buried, not destroyed in war, not abandoned to slow erosion and left to fall. Buried, carefully and methodically, under thousands of tons of layered earth carried in and packed down by hand. The enclosures, the great pillars, the carved compositions, all of it sealed beneath the hill with such care that the structures survived almost perfectly intact for 12,000 years. That is the part to hold on to. The burial was not neglect. It was engineering. Whoever did this understood exactly what they were doing. They were not closing a temple and turning their backs on it. They were preserving one. And the timing of that act is what demands attention, because it makes no sense by any rule we know. The burial lines up almost exactly with the moment farming became fully established across the region. By every model of how civilization works, that should have been the beginning, not the end. More reliable food means larger populations. Larger populations mean specialists, surplus, ambition. That is how it went in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in China. The arrival of agriculture pushes a people forward. Here, at the very moment it should have lifted them, they sealed everything away and walked off the hill. For a long time, that contradiction simply sat there, unanswered. Then the DNA arrived and offered the most grounded explanation we have. Ancient genomes recovered from the nearby site of Çayönü, dating to around 8,500 years before the Common Era, confirm that the people of this region were the direct ancestors of the Anatolian farmers who later carried agriculture into Europe. They did not die out. They did not vanish into myth. They dispersed. And in that single word, the mystery softens into something human. The builders did not disappear. They scattered. The specialized knowledge that had been held and guarded across 12 sacred sites was diluted across thousands of small farming villages spreading west, one valley at a time, until it was spread too thin to survive. The stonemasons became farmers. The keepers of the symbols became village elders with half-remembered stories. The thermal technique was forgotten within a few generations. The grammar of the carvings, once maintained with 92% precision, dissolved slowly into folklore and then into nothing. There was no catastrophe, no flood, no fire, no enemy at the gates, only transformation. A people who survived completely while the thing that made them extraordinary quietly died. And that is the real distance the hill measures. It is the gap between a civilization that builds monuments to last forever and one that eventually has to dig those same monuments back out of the ground just to prove to itself that it once existed. The people lived. The knowledge did not. Which leaves us standing in front of the largest claim of all, the one the believers cannot resist and the evidence cannot quite carry, that this rise and this loss were not the first, that it has all happened before. Separate, then, what the ground can carry from what it cannot. This much the evidence supports. One sophisticated people, living before farming, rose, reached a peak, watched their own knowledge slowly degrade, and then deliberately preserved what remained before scattering into the world that followed. That is real. That stands. The larger claim is where honesty has to plant its feet. The idea that this same cycle has turned many times before, that we are only the latest in a long line of forgotten beginnings, cannot be drawn from a single hill. The converging threads are easier to feel than to prove. So the carvings still stand, only half read, the experts still arguing over the date and the meaning. Whatever the builders were saying, they cut it into stone so it would outlast them. The question the hill leaves hanging is not what they knew. It is whether we are paying attention